In a landmark decision that is already sending shockwaves through Washington, the Supreme Court has delivered a sharp and decisive check on presidential authority, drawing a clear line on the limits of executive power. On July 28, 2025, the court, in a narrow 5-4 ruling, blocked the Trump administration's controversial plan to impose sweeping tariffs on all goods imported from the European Union, a move that would have affected billions of dollars in trade. This wasn't just about trade policy, it was a direct challenge to the president's use of emergency powers, raising fundamental questions about the balance of power in government. The case, U.S. Chamber of Commerce vs. Trump, centered on whether a president could invoke the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to enact broad economic policies without explicit approval from Congress, bypassing the usual legislative process. The court's majority firmly disagreed with Trump's argument that a trade deficit with the EU constituted a national emergency, setting a much stricter standard for what qualifies as an emergency under the law and limiting the scope of executive action. The ruling reasserts Congress's constitutional role in regulating foreign commerce, a power many legal scholars and lawmakers felt had been steadily eroding over recent decades. Business groups and economists celebrated the decision, warning that the tariffs could have triggered a damaging trade war, disrupted supply chains, and led to higher prices for American consumers and small businesses across the country. Meanwhile, supporters of the president's agenda called the ruling judicial overreach, arguing that the court was interfering with the president's duty to protect American jobs and national interests in a rapidly changing global economy. The political and economic fallout from this historic decision is just beginning to unfold, with markets reacting and both parties gearing up for a fierce debate over the future of presidential power and America's role in global trade. To grasp the Supreme Court's decision, we must look at the policy it struck down. In early 2025, President Trump announced tariffs of 15%, potentially rising to 25%, on all EU imports, citing a $200 billion trade deficit. The legal basis was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, which allows the president to regulate economic transactions after declaring a national emergency. Trump declared such an emergency, claiming EU trade practices threatened America's economic security. Critics argued IEPA was never meant for long-standing trade disputes but for genuine crises like terrorism or hostage situations. The proposed tariffs would have hit everything from German cars to Irish pharmaceuticals, raising prices for consumers and costs for businesses. The sweeping impact mobilized powerful opposition and set the stage for a legal showdown. The stakes were enormous for the U.S. economy and global trade. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, was passed by Congress in 1977, at a time when the United States was grappling with new global challenges and shifting international dynamics. The law was designed to give presidents significant flexibility to respond quickly to foreign crises, but it also included important checks, requiring congressional oversight to prevent abuse of power. Historically, presidents used IEPA only in situations involving clear and direct threats to national security, like when President Jimmy Carter froze Iranian assets during the 1979 hostage crisis, a move widely seen as necessary and justified at the time. Similarly, President Ronald Reagan invoked IEPA to sanction Libya in response to acts of terrorism, targeting specific individuals and entities rather than entire economies. For decades, the law was used for targeted strategic actions, measures that were carefully tailored to address specific threats, not to reshape broad economic policy or disrupt global markets. But the Trump administration's use of IEPA marked a major departure from this tradition, as it targeted an entire bloc of U.S. allies, the European Union, over what it called a trade imbalance. Critics argued that this move stretched the law far beyond its original intent, transforming a tool meant for emergencies into a mechanism for advancing protectionist trade policy. Previously, Trump had invoked national security to justify tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, sparking controversy and debate about the true nature of the threat. But the plan to use IEPA against the EU was even broader, raising the stakes and expanding the law's reach in unprecedented ways. These actions blurred the traditional line between economic and security threats, leaving legal scholars and America's trading partners deeply alarmed about the precedent being set. The EU tariffs represented the boldest and most sweeping use of IEPA yet, raising fears that such moves could destabilize the global trading system and trigger economic retaliation. The legal and political risks of this approach were unprecedented, sparking intense debate about the future of U.S. economic power and the rule of law. Legal challenges to the EU tariffs began almost immediately after President Trump's emergency declaration, as affected businesses and advocacy groups scrambled to respond. The move sent shockwaves through the legal and business communities, prompting urgent meetings and strategy sessions across the country. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, joined by major industry groups, filed suit, arguing that the president had overstepped his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. They claimed the law was never intended to be used for trade disputes with close allies. A federal judge quickly issued an injunction, finding that the administration's interpretation of IEPA lacked support in both the text and the legislative history of the law. The judge emphasized the importance of clear limits on executive power, especially in matters affecting the economy. The government swiftly appealed, arguing that courts should defer to the president's judgment on national security and economic threats, and warning that judicial interference could undermine the executive's ability to act decisively. The D.C. Circuit upheld the injunction, ruling that a trade deficit with allied nations does not constitute the kind of unusual and extraordinary threat required by IEPA. The court's opinion stressed the need for careful judicial review of executive actions. The split decision among the appellate judges made Supreme Court review all but inevitable, as both sides recognized the case's far-reaching implications for presidential power. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case on an expedited basis, acknowledging the enormous economic stakes and the urgent need for legal clarity. During oral arguments, the government insisted that the president must have broad authority to protect the nation's economic interests, especially in a rapidly changing global environment. The Chamber of Commerce countered that granting such sweeping power would allow presidents to bypass Congress on trade policy at will, undermining the constitutional separation of powers and threatening democratic oversight. The justices' probing questions revealed deep concern about maintaining the constitutional balance of power between the executive and legislative branches and the potential consequences for future administrations. As arguments concluded, the nation anxiously awaited a Supreme Court decision that would define the limits of executive authority in trade and set a precedent for years to come. The Trump administration argued that economic security is inseparable from national security and that the president must have the tools to act swiftly. Supporters saw tariffs as a necessary defense against unfair trade and legal challenges as attempts to undermine the president's mandate. They insisted courts should defer to the president's judgment on national threats. Critics, including business groups and legal scholars, warned that treating trade deficits as emergencies would let presidents sidestep Congress on almost any issue. They argued this would erode the separation of powers and destabilize the global economy. The debate was about more than tariffs. It was about the very structure of American government. The Supreme Court was asked to draw the line. On July 28, 2025, the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision set a new precedent for presidential power. Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, said a persistent trade deficit with allies does not meet IEPA's emergency standard. The court clarified that IEPA is for acute crises, not long-term economic policy. Roberts wrote, "To interpret a trade deficit as a national emergency would render the term emergency meaningless." The dissent argued the law leaves threat definitions to the president, warning the court was intruding on executive authority. The ruling narrows the path for future presidents to use IEPA for broad tariffs, pushing major trade decisions back to Congress. The president retains emergency powers, but only for recognizable emergencies. This decision recalibrates the balance of power between the branches of government. It's a landmark moment for constitutional law and U.S. trade policy. The Supreme Court's decision sent shockwaves through the economy. U.S. stock markets surged, with the Dow up over 500 points as investors welcomed the end of tariff threats. Automakers, retailers, and manufacturers saw their stocks jump, relieved that supply chains and profits were safe. The Chamber of Commerce called it a victory for businesses, workers, and consumers. Companies could now move forward with certainty, and some may seek refunds for past tariffs. For consumers, the ruling blocked price hikes on everything from cars to electronics, preventing a new wave of inflation. The decision was especially welcome as families faced lingering inflationary pressures. Globally, European leaders and markets cheered, seeing the ruling as a step away from protectionism. The euro strengthened, and European stocks rose. The decision restored predictability to international trade, but left ongoing US-EU negotiations in flux. The Trump administration's leverage in trade talks was significantly diminished. Beyond economics, the Supreme Court's decision is a powerful affirmation of the separation of powers. By reining in unilateral executive action, the court reinforced Congress's central role in trade policy. This ruling will force future administrations to negotiate with Congress and allies, rather than relying on emergency declarations. It signals to the world that U.S. institutions can check sudden policy shifts, restoring trust in America as a stable partner. The decision marks a shift away from confrontational tactics toward more strategic, alliance-based trade. However, the narrow vote highlights deep divisions over presidential power. The debate over the scope of executive authority is far from over. The ruling is a pivotal chapter in America's ongoing story about power, law, and identity. The world is watching how the U.S. will navigate this new landscape. The Supreme Court's decision is more than a verdict on trade. It's a recalibration of power between the President and Congress. By setting a stricter standard for emergencies under IEPA, the court has forced a return to traditional, legislative methods of regulating foreign commerce. The immediate result, a trade war averted, markets stabilized, and inflationary threats lifted. Congress now faces the challenge of crafting effective trade policy in a divided environment. The future could bring bipartisan legislation or gridlock, but the responsibility is back in lawmakers' hands. The world is watching to see if the U.S. embraces cooperation or returns to confrontation. The next chapter in American trade and democracy begins now.